The story of spirit manifestations dates from 1848 and a solitary farmhouse in the small New York village of Hydesville and centers around two little girls, Margaret, known as Maggie, and Catherine, who everyone called Kate. Successfully exploited by an older sibling while still children and credited with supernatural powers, the story of these involuntary founders of the belief in spiritualism is one of the most interesting and tragic in the long history of Hermetic philosophy. 8 and 7 years old, respectively, Maggie and Kate Fox were as full of petty devilment as any two children of their age ever were. Their fancy soon hit upon the plan to create unexplained knocks or raps around the house, puzzling their mother without much risk of detection. The idea had everything in it to charm a juvenile mischief maker. It succeeded beyond their wildest desires, proclaimed the advent of the modern spiritualist movement, made the Fox sisters renowned on both sides of the Atlantic, and destroyed them both in the process. John Fox and his wife Margaret appear to have been of the good, honest, but not mentally keen type of farmer folk. Of the two, the wife was the more simple-minded. When the nervous, superstitious woman began to hear unusual noises, which she could not account for, and which seemed in some peculiar manner connected with her children, she concluded at once that the sounds were unnatural and began to brood over the matter. Her fears increased with the persistent recurrence of the mysterious sounds, and before long she took some of the neighbors into her confidence. They were as puzzled as the mother. The Fox home became an object of suspicion, and the neighborhood set itself the task of solving the mystery.
Statement of Mrs. Margaret Fox, mother of Margaret and Catherine, 1848. On the night of the first disturbance, we all got up, lighted a candle, and searched the entire house, the noises continuing during the time and being heard near the same place. It continued on this night until we slept. On March 30th, we were disturbed all night. The noises were heard in all parts of the house. My husband stationed himself outside of the door while I stood inside, and the knocks came on the door between us. We heard footsteps in the pantry and walking downstairs. We could not rest, and I then concluded that the house must be haunted by some unhappy, restless spirit.
With the increase of interest came a proportionate increase in the noises which commenced to be known as rappings. The possibility of duplicity in the children never occurred to anyone in Hydesville, with the result that the mother's timid hint of a disembodied spirit soon became a theory. The hypothesis included a belief that the ghost was a victim of violence. Someone asked if a murder had ever been committed in the house. The ominous sounds of rappings answered in the affirmative. The theory became a proven fact. Thanks to the spirit rappings, the credulous farm folk found the imaginary crime scene and even created a make-believe victim, complete with a name and backstory. A man named Bell was the prime suspect in the alleged murder. That suspicion would fall on Bell was the natural outcome of an investigation conducted by families who had all lived in the rental home at some point in the past.
Statement of William Dusler, neighbor, 1848. I asked if my father or I had heard it. There was silence. I asked if Bell had injured it, and it made 3 raps louder than usual. I then inquired if it was murdered for money, and the sounds were heard. I asked if it was murdered by being struck on the head, and there were no sounds. I then asked if it had its throat cut, and it rapped as usual. In the same way, it was ascertained that it was asleep at the time, but was awakened when the knife entered its throat. I asked if the body was put into the cellar, and it rapped.
Statement of Miss Lucretia Pulver, former servant in the Bell household, 1848. I lived in this house with the Bell family. One night, I thought I heard a man walking in the pantry, down to the cellar, and partway across the cellar bottom. Later, Mrs. Bell sent me down to the cellar. In going across the floor, my feet sank deep in the dirt. When I told her, she laughed at me for being frightened and said it was only where rats had been at work in the ground. A day or two after this, Mr. Bell carried a lot of dirt into the cellar and was at work there sometime. A few days before I first heard the noises or anything of the kind had ever occurred, a foot peddler called there about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Mrs. Bell told me that he was an old acquaintance of theirs. Sometime later, I visited her, and she said the peddler had been there again and showed me a thimble which she had bought from him. I never saw him after that first time.
At this critical moment, Leah, the married daughter of John Fox and his wife, came home to Hydesville for a visit. More than 20 years older than her sister, she seems to have grasped instantly the possibilities and the occult powers of her little sisters, and to have taken complete command of the Fox family's affairs at once. The elder Fox and his wife had not been always united during their marriage. They were separated for a number of years. Leah and 2 siblings were conceived before this separation took place, and Margaret and Catherine years afterwards. Leah was of a very different type than either father or mother. She was cold and mercenary, and a woman comfortable with the business of fraud.
Statement of Margaret Fox, 1888. I wish to say clearly that I owe all my misfortune to that woman, my sister. I have told her time and again, "Now that you are rich, why don't you save your soul?" But at my word, she would fly into a passion. She wanted to establish a new religion, and she told me that she received messages from spirits. She told us that before we were born, spirits came into her room and told her that we were destined for great things. When spiritualism first began, Kate and I were little children, and this old woman, my other sister, made us her tools. Mother was a silly woman. She was a fanatic. She believed in these things. Spiritualism started from just nothing. We were but innocent little children. What did we know? Oh, we grew to know too much. Our sister used us in her exhibitions, and we made money for her. Now she turns upon us because she's the wife of a rich man, and she opposes us both wherever she can.
In a short time, the activity of the Fox sisters attracted literally hundreds of people to Hydesville. Realizing that there were better opportunities in more populated regions, the mother and daughters went to Rochester. The so-called spirits soon urged in laborious communications that it was needful to make their demonstrations more public, and that an investigation of the rappings ought therefore to be made by some well-known men. The spirits were even so kind as to spell out by means of an ad hoc alphabetical code those they wished to have appointed to perform this part. Naturally enough, after this compliance with their desires, the spirits directed that a public exhibition should be given. The largest hall in Rochester was hired for the purpose.
Statement of Margaret Fox, 1888. We had crowds coming to see us, and Leah made as much as 100 to 150 a night. She pocketed this. Parties came in from all parts to see us. Many, as soon as they heard a little rap, were convinced. To all questions, we answered by raps. We knew when to rap yes or no, according to certain signs which Leah gave us during the séance. Kate and I were led around like lambs. We went to New York from Rochester, and then all over the United States. We drew immense crowds. I remember particularly Cincinnati. The rooms were jammed from morning till night, and we were called upon by those old wretches to show our rappings when we should have been out at play in the fresh air.
The grand tour over, Kate, sponsored by Horace Greeley, went to school and retired from the spiritualism arena. She later returned to work with Leah, playing the part of a ghost that appeared during séances. Margaret, just developing into a young woman and destined to become the more famous of the 2 mediums, began a series of séances in rooms occupied by herself and mother in Philadelphia. In that city, romance entered her life on a day in 1853 in the person of Dr. Elisha Kent Kane, a noted Arctic explorer. His had been a remarkable career. Belonging to one of the most aristocratic families in Philadelphia, he graduated as a doctor more than 10 years previously from the University of Pennsylvania. This much experienced man of the world was instantly and irresistibly attracted to the 14-year-old medium in a strange, platonic and courtly way that was more appropriate for a 13th century knight than a 19th century doctor. It was not long before Dr. Kane determined that regardless of all obstacles, she should eventually be his wife. His family dropped its objections. Once Maggie and Alicia agreed, she would be left out of any large inheritances, and his will save some token sentimental bequests. He soon made arrangements to educate Maggie, and she was placed with a tutor in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia, where an aunt of the doctor's could have oversight of her. For some 3 or 4 years, she was thus sheltered from the world while the doctor did all in his power to eradicate from her mind everything connected with spiritualism and rappings. Then came the turn of the tide. The doctor became broken in health as a result of exposure in the Arctic and decided to go abroad. There had been neither civil or religious ceremony to mark his marriage to Margaret, but just before he sailed, in the presence of her mother and other witnesses, he declared that they were husband and wife. His health grew worse in London, and he left there for the West Indies, where Margaret and her mother were to join him. But their preparations for the journey were cut short by the announcement in the papers of his death in Havana in February 1857. Margaret was prostrated by the blow. A long, alcohol-induced sickness followed, and when she finally recovered, it was to face the world, not only friendless and alone, but penniless as well. Disappointed, disheartened, and bitter, she went back to her spiritualism and wrappings. For 30 years she wandered from place to place, holding séances and enduring the tortures of remorse and ill health. She hated herself and her life, and tried at times to drown her troubles in alcohol. The time came when she could no longer continue in this manner, forced to choose between self-destruction or confession. She first tried suicide. The attempt caused an epiphany, and she decided to come clean.
Statement of Margaret Fox, 1888. I'm going to expose spiritualism from its very foundation. I have had the idea in my head for many a year, but I have never come to a determination before. I have thought of it day and night. I loathe the thing I have been. I used to say to those who wanted me to give a séance, "You are driving me into hell." Then the next day I would drown my remorse in wine. I was too honest to remain a medium. That's why I gave up my exhibitions. I have seen so much miserable deception. Every morning of my life I have it before me. When I wake up, I brood over it. That is why I am willing to state that spiritualism is a fraud of the worst description. I have had a life of sorrow. I have been poor and ill, but I consider it my duty, a sacred thing, a holy mission to expose it.
The missive was delivered to the paper coincident with the news that Maggie was heading back to the States. The letter itself was not meant to be a confession, but was prompted by news that the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was trying for the second time to remove Katie's children from her care. Being met by reporters upon arrival in New York, Maggie spoke openly about her past, her recent attempt at self-destruction, and her choice to pull back the curtain, so to speak, to reveal the ongoing fraud that she helped promote. Maggie admitted to being a charlatan and revealed the trick she and her sister dreamed up as young girls. She offered the defense that they had been coerced into the fraud by Leah.
Statement of Margaret Fox, 1888. My sister Kate and I were very young children when this horrible deception began. We were very mischievous children and sought merely to terrify our dear mother, who was a very good woman and very easily frightened. When we went to bed at night, we used to tie an apple to a string and move the string up and down, causing the apple to bump on the floor, or we would drop the apple on the floor, making a strange noise every time it would rebound. Mother listened to this for a ton. She would not understand it and did not suspect us as being capable of a trick, because we were so young. At last, she could stand it no longer, and she called the neighbors in and told them about it. It was this that set us to discover a means of making the raps more effectually. Now, that is really just how we first got the idea of producing with the joints similar sounds to those we had made by dropping apples with a string. From trying it with our fingers, we then tried it with our feet, and it did not take long for us to find out that we could easily produce very loud raps by the action of the toe joints when in contact with any substance which is a good conductor of sound. The sounds which were heard at those times were all produced by Kate and myself, and by no other being or spirit under the sun. And that is the way we began. First, as a mere trick to frighten Mother. And then, when so many people came to see us children, we were ourselves frightened, for self-preservation forced to keep it up.
Maggie's confession was published in the Sunday edition of the New York World on October 21, 1888. Arrangements had been made for her to give a public demonstration, an exposition of the so-called spiritualistic phenomena, that same evening at the Academy of Music in New York. That night, some 2,000 or more persons crowded the Academy to witness the sensational exposure. Most of them were sober, sensible people who hailed with delight the announcement that one of the famous Fox sisters was to make a clean breast of her share in spiritualistic humbuggery. But certain portions of the house were packed with pronounced spiritualists, men and women who regarded all efforts to disillusion the public as so many personal insults. When Margaret Fox stepped before the big audience to confess orally what she had already confessed in print, she was laboring under too great a nervous strain to make any intelligent utterance. Those in charge of the affair, realizing that a lecture was out of the question, at once suggested that she immediately give a demonstration of the wrappings. But if her tongue had lost its power, her supernatural toe joint had not. a plain wooden table resting upon 4 short legs and having the properties of a sounding board was placed in front of her. Removing her shoe, she placed her right foot upon this little table. The entire house became breathlessly still and was rewarded by a number of little short, sharp raps. A committee of 3 physicians from the audience ascended the stage and, having made an examination of her foot during the progress of the rappings, unhesitatingly agreed that the sounds were made by the action of the first joint of her large toe. The exposure attracted widespread attention. Letters poured in from far and wide, begging for confirmation, explanation, or denial. Many who had believed in spiritualism wrote most pathetically. None better expresses what a blow the exposure was to thousands who had accepted as genuine the mysterious raps than the following from a woman in Boston.
Hundreds of thousands have believed through you and you alone. Hundreds of thousands eagerly ask you whether all the glorious light that they fancied you had given them was but the false flicker of a common candle of fraud. If, as you say, you were forced to pursue this imposture from childhood, I can forgive you, and I am sure God will, for he turns not back the truly repentant. The disclosures that you make take from me all that I have cherished most. There is nothing left for me now but to hope for the reality of that repose which death promises us. It is perhaps better that the delusion should be at last swept away by one single word, and that word is fraud.
Margaret Fox's confession did not bring her the relief or friends she had hoped for, nor did it end her connection with spiritualism. Glad as she would have been to give it up for good, her theatrical exposure was a financial failure, and before long she was down and out again. Once more she resorted to spiritualism as a means of livelihood, giving séances and mediumistic meetings in a number of cities throughout the United States. But her power of fooling the public was gone. Having confessed to deceit once, no amount of persuasion on her part could convince the public that she was genuine, and in place of the thousands who had flocked to her in her younger days, she never had more than a handful at her meetings. Sometime after the confession, a recantation was circulated as coming from Maggie. It made little difference, for the career of the unfortunate woman was nearly over, frequently overcome by drink, forced on by privation and misery. Death came to her on March 8, 1895. Less than 7 years after she had stood in a crowded theatre and demonstrated the method of making the raps which had brought her both fame and heartache for 4 decades, modern spiritualism received a severe jolt in the confession of Margaret Fox. But it was not the death blow she hoped for. Mediums continue to fleece poor misguided souls, easily fooled by simple tricks and probably will forever. Maggie Fox might not recognize the movement she started. Spirit rapping and crystal balls have been replaced by psychics and ghost hunters armed with night vision cameras and blinking EMF detectors. Fortunately for most people, interest in modern spiritualism extends no further than watching videos of this monument to gullibility.